The topic, obviously, this evening is philanthropy. And just to frame things, Bill, what's the rough amount that since you and Melinda began, you've dispersed in total?
Yeah, I don't, the actual number is a little over 30 billion. It's not a figure of merit in the sense that it's awfully easy to write checks. And so, the question is what happened, for that money. But we're giving away about $3.5 billion a year now. And so it adds up over time.
Well, it is a figure of great merit. Which, and people here, I think, in their own ways have lots of questions, and there are cards on everybody's seat, and I'd encourage you to fill out the cards, and I'll try and ask Bill as many questions as possible this evening. But I'm sure people are curious about how you think about allocating the capital.
Well, everybody should pick something, and sometimes you'll have some really rational criteria of why you pick the things you get involved with. Some relative, something you saw, something you think your work skill set enables you to do. In our foundation, given that we were going to have very large scale, we said, okay, what's the greatest injustice on a global basis? And we decided the fact that when we got started, there were the chance of dying of poor people was dramatically higher, in the case of a child, about 40 times higher than in a middle-income country. And the reason that that was the case is there were certain diseases that could be solved with some big upfront costs, but actually very low marginal costs that just weren't being done, things like malaria. And so global health was our idea that all lives, you shouldn't have, just because you're poor, a higher chance of dying, particularly children. And we saw that during our lifetime, by getting great scientists to come in, inventing vaccines, getting those distributed, we could eliminate that inequity. And so, when we got started, as I said, about 10 million a year were dying. Now we're down to about 6.5 million. There's a pretty clear path over the next 15 years to get down to about 3 million. And in our lifetime, we should be able to get down to 1 million, which would be, that's the elimination of the differential between rich and poor.
Now, when you started, Bill, did you say to yourself that you've got a specific goal by 2020, by 2030 that you were aiming for, that you wanted to achieve, or?
Yeah, we did, but not everybody has to do things that way.
Well,
that's just kind of the...
But I think people would be interested in what those goals were. Well,
I was, pretty naive about philanthropy and sort of thinking, okay, all the good causes were probably already picked, and that, by the time I got there, the marginal value of my dollars would be lower than all the previous ones because people were so rational about all the great things that they were doing. And so you can call it either good news or bad news, that as we looked into things, we gave a grant for $30 million on a malaria vaccine and became the biggest funders of malaria vaccines in the world. That's a thing that at the time was killing over 1 million children a year, just that one thing alone. So we found some things that really weren't being done. The one in the US is that we picked is this idea of how can you help teachers be better? Why are some teachers so good? How do you transfer the excellence to others? What is it about classroom observation, feedback, personnel system that can do that? And the stunning thing there was the U.S. spends $600 billion a year on K through 12, but they spend essentially nothing on R&D. So you can take all the sectors of the economy and say, okay, pharmaceuticals, 24% R&D budget, software, 13% R&D budget. If you a priori said for the benefit of society, what should the R&D percentage be in education? You might say it should be one of the higher ones because it, in a sense, is what empowers every other field of activity to be highly productive or to be to have justice or citizenship. But in fact, it has the lowest of any area of human activity. And so we saw that as something we could come in and do. So we set goals for the U.S. to not decline, to actually be educating a much higher percentage of its kids to be able to go to college. And so every area we picked and had some pretty big goals. Some we had to get into it, like my wife, Melinda's really focused on our reproductive health thing, where women can get access to tools of contraception. And it was very important to go out and survey, because we wanted to do that on a voluntary basis. Survey, okay, how many women wanted these tools, particularly if the tools, you could have scientists innovate and make them cheaper, more effective, that kind of thing. How many women would use them voluntarily, and then set a goal to say, okay, let's cut in half the women who want that capability and the women who don't get it within the next 10 years.
I suspect the topic, Bill, that people know the least about, or are least familiar with in the Foundation's work, is agriculture, particularly in Africa. And maybe it's worth just spending a minute or so describing what you've been trying to achieve there and when you got started doing that.
Yeah, agriculture, when Warren Buffett gave his gift to the Foundation, which at the time was about a $30 billion gift, and it's paid in on a yearly basis. It's in the form of a Berkshire stock. That was kind of phenomenal and unexpected, although I'd been friends with him for a long time. And that let us up our level of ambition a few notches higher. And so we really said, okay, let's get serious about agriculture. Because agriculture, over 70% of the poor people in the world are people who have very small farms and primarily are just eating the output that they're able to grow locally. And so if you can raise the productivity on those farms, then you get surplus, you can pay school fees. That productivity, if you take any country that's gotten out of the poverty trap, agricultural productivity is the first enabling factor that lets them get there. So the idea of taking the crops that poor people grow, that I didn't know much about farming, because I grew up in a city, so I'd never heard of sorghum and cassava and how you make these things better. But who in the world should make crops more productive, particularly these public domain crops that nobody gets to make money on?
Now, you focused on rice as well, have you?
Right. There's not a business model. So when you make rice better, there's not somebody who, that's not seen as a big profit opportunity. Right. So only government and philanthropy will go in and pay for that basic science. And yet the benefit, if you can make rice, we have this crazy thing called C4 rice, which is a way to change the photosynthetic engine of the rice to be like corn, which means it's quite a bit more productive. That's a huge deal. It's overnight, it's at least a 30% increase in rice production, requires less water, less fertilizer. It's good in a lot of ways. That would be a very dramatic thing. And yet, there's no natural funding source for it because the profit motive doesn't exist there. Right. And so we became the big rice people. There's even a rice that has vitamin A in it, which is a huge problem. There's vitamin A and there's iron. Iron deficiency, vitamin A deficiency is a huge problem in Africa. It doesn't kill people so much as their brain never develops fully. And so if you do like an IQ study of different areas, which you have to be careful that it's not politically incorrect, average IQ in Africa is below 85. And that's because of these medical insults, cerebral malaria, but primarily lack of nutrition. That kind of diet that you're eating there just doesn't allow your brain to develop. And so that's part of the poverty trap, is that. And so getting these better seeds that have these micronutrients, including iron and vitamins, that's a key part of the program to let kids achieve their potential.
Do you have a sense in cassava and sorghum and rice of how many acres or thousands of acres are now being planted with new variants of seeds that have stemmed from the Foundation's work?
Yeah, in the IT sector, of course, you do something and within a small number of years, magic is happening. I wish in all the areas we worked that things would proceed that quickly. And new seeds, if you're using conventional breeding techniques, it's typically 5 years between when you start and when stuff gets out. And so today, we have a variety of rice this is our most successful agricultural product, that about 10% of the rice grown in Asia now is this new rice. And part of the reason, and it's catching on very quickly, part of the reason is it has this incredible characteristic. With rice, you grow it in flooded fields, but you can't let the water get above the top of the rice or the rice dies. But we found a gene, actually a professor at UC Davis found a gene, that if you put into the rice, even if it gets submerged, it'll shut down and wait instead of dying. And then when the water goes away, it grows naturally. So that was when the adoption rate was very unusual, because you could see the farmer who grew the stuff, the new stuff, their rice lived, and if you over here had the old rice, your rice died. And so that was so-called sort of a word of mouth type adoption. That'll get up to 50% over the next 5 years. But you really have to think in terms of a decade. When you're trying to do a new vaccine, a new education personnel system, a new toilet, we don't have much that can be done in less than a decade.
Mm-hmm. What do you've been obviously full-time at Philanthropy for a bunch of years now, but at Philanthropy for 20 plus years. What do you wish you'd known about philanthropy that you know now when you started out?
Well, I knew nothing until it was in the 1990s. I mean, I had this vague notion that the resources I was lucky enough to have, that Microsoft's success was generating, that I'd want to do some type of foundation. And so I read about Rockefeller and Carnegie, Mellon, various people had done things, and in fact done a fantastic job. It's quite amazing what a great philanthropist Rockefeller was in terms of research, schools for blacks, hookworm, he was way ahead of his time in terms of how he thought about things and did things. So I wasn't quite sure, and I thought, okay, I'll think about that in my 60s. But the one thing that worked out pretty well was my dad and Patty Stonecipher, who had been at Microsoft and chosen to retire, volunteered to help out, and I trusted them. And so I gave them resources, so they got things going, really starting in about 1997. So we put computers in every library in North America, and we started doing reproductive health stuff. And we started learning about disease, and I was shocked. I was shocked about two things. Shocked about the level, but also amazed at the progress that was possible to make. That is, that a few interventions could make a huge difference. If you go back to 1960, about 20% of all children died before the age of 5. When the foundation gets started, it's at 9%. Now it's down at 6%. And so, that's a big deal. It's more than, any war, any tragedy, anything you hear about is these deaths one at a time. Anyway, so I didn't know anything about poor countries. I didn't know anything about foreign aid and how well it was spent. I had this skeptical view. So my idea was, okay, I'll fund a bunch of scientists and they'll come up with clever things. The idea that clever things are the hardest thing is actually getting things out and getting them adopted, and that even in your product profile, in terms of what you ask the crazy scientists to do, you have to understand the conditions in the place that you want this adoption. That's a constant, gotcha. That right. You have to think of that as a whole system. And even when working in Africa, where we're just trying to do fairly straightforward things of helping mothers deliver safely or get people vaccines, this idea of how well you run the personnel system. Do you train these workers who don't have to get a ton of education, but they have to get some? Do you compensate them? Do you measure what they do? Again and again across all our work, in education, health, agriculture, the issue of the proper design of the personnel system and the measurement system keeps coming back again and again. And I should have known that before we got involved in it.
But there are also the mundane things I know reading about the vaccines and just keeping the cold storage chain working, things that one wouldn't normally think about here, I think.
Yeah, and that's why it's good to go out in the field. This cold chain, vaccines, if they get up to room temperature, then they don't last very long. And so they have the whole delivery from vaccine manufacturer to when you give the child a shot, it has to stay cold, 2 degrees C to 8 degrees C. It looks like we have now a design, we challenged some scientists on that, we have essentially a thermos so that instead of having to get electricity or propane and the energy inputs are very unreliable, they're very expensive, it looks like we'll be able to do that in a purely passive form. But I had no idea what cold chain was and how that was one of the things that prevented getting this delivery done in a good way. And yet, when we turned to scientists and put that problem in front of them, modern material science technology, we were able to come up with a great solution.
Here's some questions from the audience. And again, feel free to fill out the cards and I'll ask as many of these as possible. This is from wonderful Maria Allegra, who's the founder and CEO of Chartboost. And her question is, why are you here talking to us today, Bill? What are you hoping to inspire in a bunch of young company founders?
Well, I just want to share how much fun I'm having with Philanthropy, working in partnership with Melinda, that you can have an impact, that picking something that you care about in terms of learning, your time, your voice, maybe eventually more time, and if you're quite successful getting some resources, that it can be this incredibly fulfilling thing. I've had 5 years now where this has been my full-time activity, and for this stage, it's every bit as challenging, interesting as running a software company, developing software was early in my career. And so just talking about that, I wish I'd had the opportunity to talk to philanthropists about what they had done wrong and what they were excited about as I got into this thing. And the more people who do philanthropy at a younger age, you want to get down the learning curve before you retire. You don't want to just retire and then, okay, now I'll do this nice stuff. It's very helpful to be trying things out, seeing what works, and so you're really quite up to speed by the time you're able, time-wise, resource-wise, to get engaged in a very significant way.
Different topic, HIV, from Naveen Jain of the Immunity Project. Are we close to a cure for HIV, asks Naveen, and what scientific approach are you most excited about regarding HIV?
Yeah, so HIV, the big breakthrough was that you can treat people by putting them on drugs, antiretroviral drugs, and you take 3 or 4 at a time. And you have to take them for your entire life. And your compliance level has to be very high. If you miss much, you'll develop drug resistance, then you'll move to another therapy. And so that's a very complex and expensive regime. It's amazing. The U.S. has been very generous in giving like $6 billion a year to buying those drugs and getting them out to people, primarily in Africa, who have the disease. The ideal would be, like other diseases, to have a set of drugs you can give somebody and then the disease is gone. So like with tuberculosis, you get it, but if you take antibiotics, you have to take them for 6 months. We're working on that. But then it completely goes away. So the fact that HIV is chronic forever is a real challenge, particularly in poor countries, because showing up and having those drugs there is way more difficult than it is in rich countries. There are some approaches that we fund where you would have an effective cure. It turns out that if you suppress this virus from replicating at extreme levels for about a year, many people can go off drug treatment and the disease does not come back. So there's a variety of new drugs that are very powerful, including some that are antibody-derived. The big breakthrough in AIDS in the last 5 years has been the understanding of these antibodies that grab the virus and stop it from operating. And some of these are very, very effective. And so there's a consortium here in California, there's one in New York, there's one in Washington, D.C. that are coming up with these antibodies. So there's a good chance that we will be able to not have to go for these full treatment regimes. Now, the other thing is to prevent people from getting it in the first place, and that's where you'd like to have a vaccine. But you have 30 million people who have HIV, so no matter whether you got a vaccine tomorrow, which the earliest we'd have a vaccine is about 8 years from now. So by then we'll have 46 million people that we need to have some way of simplifying the...
But you've also been working on circumcision as a prevention, right?
Yeah, that's kind of a strange thing. It turns out that the...
Male circumcision.
Yeah, male
right?
circumcision. Yeah. Female circumcision is being... genital cutting is being wiped out, fortunately, and there's some great work that we're a partner in that does that. Male circumcision reduces the transmissiveness of AIDS by over 60%. And so believe it or not, we invented a device that makes it very simple to do male circumcision. You can look at it online if the parental block on your machine is turned off. But it's really amazing technology. And, I've interviewed a lot of people before, after, and said, what was it like? Strangely, the reputation is that if you get circumcised, that there's something else good happens. So the uptake has been pretty strong when this has been offered in various parts of Africa. So and it's very cheap. It's less than $30 per circumcision. And so, when you're dealing with infectious disease, every case you prevent has this exponential benefit, because then that's a person who doesn't infect another person. So taking the force of infection and reducing it dramatically by circumcision, if you go out 10 years, it has a fairly big thing. Now, a vaccine would be better, because the circumcision doesn't completely prevent you from getting the disease. And that's one thing you always have to be careful of. If we disinhibit people, that is, once they get circumcised, they engage in much riskier behavior. They could offset the benefit. Turns out they don't, but that was important to study to make sure that we didn't have that negative effect.
Different topic, conservation in the environment. Will from Flight wonders, where does conservation fit into your philanthropy, if at all?
Yeah, I'll have to give a fairly simple answer to that. The most important thing for the environment, you could say, is the size of the human population. And in fact, on a global basis, we don't have a problem. That is, most places in the world, the population is not growing. We have this adverse selection that there are places like Pakistan, northern India, Yemen, parts of Africa, which will triple in population over the next 40 years. And these are exactly the places where agricultural productivity, infrastructure, education, they can't handle it. And so when we first got involved in the foundation, I thought, well, health is hard, because do I want more people or less people? And if you cure malaria, doesn't that mean more people? Well, it turns out that's completely and totally wrong, even though it's intuitive. As you improve health, parents choose to have less children, because they're essentially optimizing to have a very high chance of have two surviving through childhood. So as childhood survival goes up, population growth goes down, and there are no exceptions to that. And so that was great news, because that let us really get enthused about improving health. So we do the health stuff that'll reduce population growth. Now, I happen to, outside the foundation, do a lot of investing in new energy technology, because very inexpensive CO2-free energy generation is a very important thing to avoid climate change and just to help the poor in general. Mm-hmm. But that's a gigantic private market. It is a case where trickle-down actually does work. And if you can't satisfy the rich market, you shouldn't do it for the poor market, because what they need is essentially the same. So that's done outside the foundation. So, climate change, population growth, those are my main things. There's a very good book that came out recently called The Bet, which talks about Paul Ehrlich versus Julian Simon, and the whole view of is the environment falling apart, and how should we think about that, where the role of innovation was greatly underestimated by some of the people who cared about the environment.
This one, Bill, comes from Name Optional, Company Optional. How should young people like us balance philanthropy in our careers during our 20s and 30s?
Well, certainly, I didn't do much philanthropy in my 20s and 30s. I didn't believe in weekends, vacation, so philanthropy wasn't the only thing I didn't believe in. And, I was just fanatical. And if you're, accumulating capital at some high rate, then you have a good excuse for putting off when you're going to disperse that capital, because, there's other people now who can be doing it. I do think, I wish I'd had an awareness, at least a basic awareness of the different living conditions around the world and what were the missing things that caused those big differences. Because I do think companies within their area of expertise I work with the pharmaceutical companies, I call up pharmaceutical company CEOs all the time and ask them for things to help with global health. I call up mobile companies, banks, and the food companies. The large companies will jump in and do these things. And in most companies, there's some nexus to how they could be helpful to the poor. And you want to start your thinking process so you have something that really draws you in when you decide to get involved. So I'd say your voice, some education is a great thing. For me, having it as a joint activity with my wife has been a phenomenal thing. Mm-hmm. I always enjoyed having a partner in business, Paul Allen at the early stage, Steve Ballmer later. Now I have sort of and Melinda's the partner doing this stuff, and that's a lot of fun. I think it's very enriching to have that joint activity.
Jonathan Kaplan, who's the founder of the Melt and before that of the inventor of the flip camera, wonders your thoughts on how to get overseas donors to prioritize philanthropy in the fashion that you have. And you've obviously traveled around talking to people there in different countries. What are your thoughts about different cultures outside the US and their approach to giving?
Well, philanthropy is strongest in the United States, and that goes back over 100 years. And it's a very positive thing. Philanthropy is very small compared to the private sectors, like 90%, governments like 9%, and philanthropy is like 1%. But there's some things like incenting scientists to invent new toilets, doing new seeds, that neither private sector, because there's not the profit opportunity, or the government, because it's just not good at backing innovation in general. It can back basic research, but once you get beyond that, it's not willing to take the risk. So philanthropy is catalytic. Showing the government how to spend its education dollars on a better personnel system, that's a very high leverage thing if you can do it. So I do think in India and China we'll be able to develop, that there will emerge a tradition of philanthropy. And so when I'm in those countries, I sit and talk with people, and it's definitely growing. The government in both cases can do things. In this country, we have an estate tax benefit and a tax deduction. We make it easy to do foundations that are treated well. So there's some enabling factors, but basically it's all about examples. If Rockefeller hadn't done what he did, I might be doing less because I wouldn't have had that to read about as a role model. So the more people we get drawn in the U.S., philanthropy is growing. And the tech sector, because it's first-generation fortunes, and these companies are global, so you kind of get out and see things, has been, and I think will continue to be, generous beyond most other industries in terms of what people do with their wealth.
John Graham, who's the co-founder of Humble Bundle, asks, what's the best philanthropic ROI you've ever achieved with a project?
Well, in our global health work, if we are spending $2,000, we can save a life. That is, we can get a new vaccine, we can do more measles campaigns. So anything that doesn't save a life for $2,000 just isn't worth doing. And so that's a bar that everything has to be compared against, if you believe that all lives have equal value. Obviously, disease in the U.S., the marginal benefit, you're spending millions per life saved there. And so that it just shows that we are, at least the way the world behaves, we're treating those lives very differently. So the biggest thing we've done is getting new vaccines created and getting them out to all the children of the world. That's where that's why childhood deaths went from 10 million a year to 6 million a year. The vast majority of that. There's a little bit of it, about 20%, that's general economic progress, which leads to better diets and all sorts of good things. But the majority of that is a set of new vaccines that got out and reduced those childhood deaths. And so that's the best thing that we've done.
Rob Spiro, who's the co-founder of Good Eggs here in San Francisco, wonders whether you think private companies, by which he means private and public companies, have a role to play in ambitious humanitarian projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they can have their employees volunteer to get involved in things. I think particularly if they can connect it. So a company like Microsoft making software free and available to schools around the world, or if refugees are lost, want to get in contact with loved ones, making sure there's clever solutions that in any troubled area go in and solve those problems, or taking satellite mapping and letting us find where kids aren't being vaccinated, or helping farmers understand the productivity of their crops using that satellite data. So I think companies should all think, okay, what is it that we could do that is in favor of equity as well as our normal activities? And you obviously have skill sets in many cases where helping nonprofit groups that are fairly inept when it comes to digital tools and measurement, just making available some of that power. Now you have to pick the nonprofit that can benefit from it, but that is super important. They are not in the digital age, and yet properly used, it could make their dollars go a lot further.
So there's another anonymous question here, and the question is, if you doubled your annual spend from one figure of merit to a figure twice that size, what would you spend it on?
It would be hard to double. You could spend, so in the U.S., when we're doing research and doing pilot personnel systems on how you can get feedback and what the career structure should look like and what professional development should look like, what schools of education should do. A lot of these things you could intensify by 20 or 30%. The upstream search for new vaccines, the research spending, particularly as the U.S. government's cutting its medical research budget, there are some holes that's creating that are fairly sizable and very troubling that, we like to be incremental on top of them, but unfortunately with what's going on, we would fund some young investigators that now, with their decrease, they're less able to fund. So yeah, we probably, over a 3-year period, we could figure out how to double. And in fact, we will be increasing a fair bit because the way I've invested has good enough returns that we'll increase our budgets a fair bit.
Reza Suleiman, who's the founder and CEO of Achievers, wonders, what do you want your legacy to be?
Well, legacy is what people think after you die. So, hopefully you never have a legacy because you don't die. Warren Buffett has an envelope that you're supposed to open when he dies, and it says, "Check my pulse."
Johnny Carson had one for his tombstone, which was, "I'll be right back."
So it'd be nice to have achieved some big goals, but you don't need to be known for doing that stuff. It's enjoyable to do the work. It's enjoyable, the scientists, you get to be involved with doing the thing. So it's not necessarily aimed at some memory.
I know we're running out of time here. We could easily talk for another couple of hours. Just a couple of more personal questions, Bill. You have a reputation for being a voracious reader and consumer of online courses. How much time a week these days do you spend studying and reading?
Well, I like to, use my time efficiently. So, when you travel, you can always read lots of books. And whenever I'm on the treadmill, I can watch courses. The Learning Company, the great courses. So I watch those while I'm doing the treadmill. And I think in general, in a week, you can get, something like 12 to 15 hours of reading and watching courses in. I mean, that's my habit, which I enjoy. I find it quite relaxing. And the number of great courses on, meteorology, geology, the sciences, the economy. There's a lot of great stuff. Now, I admit these serial dramas have come out and they're starting to compete, House of Cards versus meteorology. If you're smart and you never watch the first episode, meteorology. But once you're into that first episode, boom,
both of
meteorology is going to sit there for a while. They don't have quite the suspense in that
even though
course.
Both have stars in them.
Absolutely.
You've obviously met everybody that there is to meet, a lot of interesting, famous people today. If you had to pick 4 or 5 people who were dead before you were born that you wish you could have met, who would they be?
Well, I wanted to meet Feynman. In fact, I was organized to go do it, and then unfortunately he passed away. So he would have been a very interesting person to talk to. I never met Teller. I work a lot with somebody who was a protege of his, Lowell Wood, but Edward Teller was an interesting person. I did get to spend some time with Nelson Mandela. He's, inspiring, great, probably one of the most interesting conversations I've gotten to have. Who else would I have wanted to meet? They say Newton wasn't a nice guy, but still would have been interesting to meet him. I have a soft spot for scientists who made advances and really did things. I think Deng Xiaoping would have been interesting to meet. I mean, arguably in terms of who, by being very talented, changed human welfare more than any individual ever for the positive. Stalin, Hitler, Mao sort of own the negative, at least within the last several hundred years. But Deng Xiaoping, what happened in China between 1979 and, say, 30 years after that, or even up to the present, in terms of reducing poverty, reducing death, nothing like it has ever been seen in the history of the planet. There was a goal, a so-called Millennium Development Goal, to achieve by 2015 of cutting absolute poverty in half. Well, that was achieved years before it was a goal, but over 70% of it was in one country because poverty was reduced so dramatically in China. And of course, it represents 20% of the global population. It represented 40% of the poor people, and now it represents less than 5%. Anyway, it would have been interesting to talk to him.
So, 2 final questions. There's one here from a couple, Lisa and Brian Sugar, the co-founders of Pop Sugar, I think, judging by the question, inspired to do something. And their question is, how do we get started?
Well, I think you can take a local charter school and get involved. You can, volunteer there, teach there, provide resources. You can go up to donorschoose.com and see a teacher at a local public school who wants a little bit of money to do a field trip or a project. I think the first thing people do in philanthropy should be something local that you can actually see it in action. And there are many, many, many good choices. Beyond that, I have this bias towards helping the poorest of the world. So getting out to Africa or the poor parts of Asia, and of course, do something, see the beauty there, but also get a sense, of what's going on and how you might help. And there certainly are organizations like Save the Children that are very good at, if somebody wants to go out and see these things, Care International, a lot, and our foundation helps organize a lot of these things too. There's great opportunities to get out and see the great needs and not just be brought down by it, to see the incredible progress that's being made.
Finally, if you were 19 or 20 today and thinking about leaving a well-known school on the East Coast and to do something brand new, fresh, and invigorating and exciting that you wanted to spend the rest of your life doing, you have a sense of what it would be today?
Well, science-based activities are what change the rules of the game. And so in the world of software, finally machine learning is going to move into the mainstream. And so, doing a software company that is doing human intelligence, that might be interesting to do. There's certainly a lot of things in disease. There's a lot of things in energy. Inventing cheap energy. That would be a huge contribution to the world. So I think science-based activity, there's probably more because of all this, software power and deep understanding in material science, genomics that we have today. There's unbelievable things that can get done. So I'd pick some science paradigm-based thing that could have big impact.
Bill, thank you very much. You've got just a little glimpse of a remarkable man, obviously. Thank you so much for spending time with all of us here. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. It's great. Thank you.